there, Cheryl, the 3-point for your clarification that Admiston is a 3-point pastoral charge just 10 minutes north and west of Renfrew, Ontario. So, three of us in Ontario today. I'm in Burlington, Ontario, and Tim is in Kansas City, Missouri. And we're excited to hear from you, Tim, on the topic of holistic leadership. We know that you've been part of Jacob's Well Church in Kansas City for a long time, working as the senior pastor, and then took a number of years away in New Zealand and are now back in that community. So we look forward to hearing from your experience.
Well, thank you.
This webinar this webinar will be 1 hour, and Tim has graciously agreed to let you have access to his PowerPoint presentation. And I'll just quickly show you how to download that so that you have it for reference following the webinar. At the right-hand column of your screen, you'll see a little box that's titled Files. If you click the name, Holistic Leadership, and highlight that, and then click Download the file, you'll be able to save the PowerPoint presentation that Tim's using today to your computer. Following the webinar, you'll be invited to fill out feedback on the webinar, and so we will leave this page and you'll see several polls, and if you could just select your responses, that will give us an idea as to how to continue to offer great webinars in the future. So I'm going to disappear from the screen. I'll still be here. If you have any questions or comments for me, feel free to type them into the chat pod. However, my video image won't be here. So I'll sign off for now, and welcome to you, Tim.
Josephine. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm excited to be with you. As Josephine said, I'm the senior pastor at Jacob's Well Church. We started in 1998. I worked as the senior founding pastor till 2009 when I resigned and went to New Zealand for a couple years and taught leadership at a theological college there, and have been back for the last year and a half back in a senior pastor role. And my particular passion is about leadership, specifically how it's shaped by theology and how creativity affects that. And part of that is from my own journey. I came to ministry. I think most people come to ministry through a circuitous route. Mine was first in the arts and then into seminary. I was an art major in my undergraduate work in design and illustration, and that was a significant way of shaping kind of my understanding of how creativity works, how it works in community. But pretty quickly I felt a call to ministry, not to make a living as a artist, at least in that way. And so I went to seminary after being in ministry as a youth pastor for a few years. And what I began to discover was, in one sense, it's not that art isn't cerebral, but when you're an artist, you're moving from your heart a lot. When I went to seminary, the academic side was in my head a lot. And I felt like I could be in communities, not just in seminary and art school, but also then in churches, where it seemed like we were able to engage one aspect of our identity, the head, but usually it was at the expense of the heart. You could have one, but you usually marginalize the other. And so for me, the church plant, Jacob's Well, became, in some senses, an experiment to try and figure out if we could do a more holistic way of both personally finding a way to express my calling, but also in a community that allowed both things to live well with each other, to not marginalize the head at the expense of the heart, or to expense the heart or to engage the heart at the expense of the head. And so that's a little bit of how I've gotten into this conversation. I've been trying to create or find a space where I could live as a fully engaged leader, person, human being made in the image of God. I think it's also really critical given the context of our ministry, this idea of holistic integration of head and heart, particularly as it gets embodied, as it gets incarnated in how a person leads, how a community embodies its faith. And so, especially as we try to engage imaginatively with what we're doing, I think the church in the West is facing a crisis of imagination. I think it may be the single most significant crisis that the church is facing, a crisis of imagination. And I think many people are not even aware that imagination has much to do with the church at all, or to begin with, which is probably a sign of the problem we have. Let me just give you a quick definition of imagination. Um, here's one working definition: the faculty or action of forming new ideas, images, or concepts of external objects that are not present to the senses. Okay, so it seems to me that that sounds a lot like what Jesus was inviting his disciples to do. He says, "Behold," in other words, it's an invitation to see the kingdom of God is at hand. Um, Clearly, when Jesus spoke those words, they were having a crisis of imagination. In first century Judaism, in the political context of the first century, their imaginative framework was different than the one Jesus was proclaiming. They did not see the kingdom because they had a preconceived notion of what that kingdom would look like when it came. And so when Jesus comes and says, "Behold, the kingdom of God is at hand," there's a major dissonance happening, a major disconnect, which is perhaps why, at least in Mark's opening chapter of his gospel, Jesus uses the word metanoia, which we've translated repent, which has generally come to mean turn away from your sins. But if you look at the Greek there, there's a sense in which that's the case. But really, metanoia means come out of your mind. And I think what he's saying essentially is wake up. That the story that you've been living in, the way that you've been framing your notions of the kingdom, what it means to be God's people, it's caused you to miss what God is up to, what's happening. It's probably instructive to us that the opposite of metanoia is paranoia. Paranoia means to collapse in on yourself, to become disconnected from reality. So to repent, according to Jesus, is to come out of yourself, to get in touch with reality, which is, I think, why Jesus says metanoia. There's an alternate reality that's available to you, but you've got to begin to live in a different narrative. And I think that's where the church is. I think we're having a crisis of imagination where the ways in which we've conceptualized what it means to be the body of Christ, the way we engage our communities, the way we think about and articulate the nature of the gospel, all those things, while good in terms of the tradition they've come out of, we're facing a crisis of imagination for knowing how to engage moving forward. So I would like to kind of start out by saying, I think, and this may be obvious to you all, and I'm sure it is, that imagination is critical to leadership, especially if we're going to go somewhere that we've never been before. But unfortunately, for many of us in leadership, we've either been educated in a way that's kind of domesticated our imagination, or we don't have the creative faculties to think about where we need to go. It's just so critical that we are engaging our imagination in that way. But it's not easy to do that. One of the books that I've read that's on the final page of the PowerPoint when I list some resources is a book by a guy named Edwin Friedman called A Failure of Nerve: Leadership in the Age of the Quick Fix. And Friedman was a rabbi in a synagogue for 30 years, and then he got into the social sciences and he began to talk about leadership and how leaders differentiate themselves from their congregations in order to do the kind of leadership that I'm trying to describe. And he talks about how leaders, which I'm sure you all have experienced, how they don't operate independent of the system they're a part of. Leaders function within systems, and for systems to change, for systems to grow, for systems to be able to do things differently, to experience transformation, to begin to go places that have never been gone before, leadership is critical to that. It takes a significant leader to help move a congregation into a new way of seeing. And one of the things that Friedman says is that systems and that leaders can become imaginatively gridlocked. He says that there are three kind of characteristics of systems that have become imaginatively gridlocked, and they're interrelated. So the first is that oftentimes when a system is imaginatively gridlocked, there's an unending cycle of we just have to try harder. We just have to keep trying harder at the thing that we've been doing. Um, the second characteristic of an imaginatively gridlocked system is that rather than reframing the questions, we just constantly go looking for answers. Tell me the one thing that I need to do. Give me the model that I need, instead of reframing the very nature of what it is we think we're doing and being called to. If you think about the ministry of Jesus, he's constantly doing the latter, not the former. He's constantly, someone comes to him and they bring him these binary options: Jesus, this or this. Is it right to pay taxes to Caesar? This or this? And what does Jesus do? He reframes the question. He says, no, you're operating down here, but the reality of the kingdom is happening here. And so, that second characteristic, according to Friedman, is that oftentimes when we accept the questions that are being asked to us as leaders on the terms that they're being asked, then oftentimes our imaginations get stopped up. They're gridlocked because the answers need to happen at a different level than we're currently operating on, which then you can see how that adds to just trying harder. And then the third characteristic is that it gets trapped in false dichotomies, this or that. So anyway, I find that to be really helpful, because what he then goes on to say is that when a system becomes imaginatively gridlocked, it cannot free itself by more thinking about the problem. It cannot get free by just doing more thinking. Learning on its own does not change the way we see or think. And that's where he begins to then introduce the fact that we are emotional and relational creatures. And so, if we're going to begin to move differently in relationship to our congregations, to our context, to our denomination, there has to be a shift that happens in our emotional processes. And the reason that is true is because imagination and curiosity are not cognitive rational processes. It's not what it's about. It's about being willing to risk, and that's an emotional, relational reality. And so, for a leader to risk, they have to be willing to separate themselves from the anxiety of the system they're trying to lead in order to do imaginative work. They have to be willing to separate themselves from all that's going on in a congregation in terms of its anxiety in order to do something different. So, leadership, when we talk about holistic leadership, it's not just about knowing the right things to think or even the right things to do, but there's an emotional, relational element to it that says, I am connected to you, congregation. I am connected to you, context, but I am also differentiated in a way that allows me and us to go in places that may be scary. So, can I give an example of a false dichotomy? Yes. Well, let me think about that for a minute. I think in terms of what I was getting at with Jesus is, this or that, and the answer is up here. In terms of how it's played out in the context of our congregation, maybe. Um, yeah, I'm just drawing a blank right now. Let me think about it for a minute and maybe come back to it. Is that okay, Cheryl? Or does anybody else have an idea of a contextual situation that goes on in a church where it feels like, hey, we've got to either do this or this, and maybe there needs to be something different that happens altogether? I was thinking about embodied, disembodied. Yeah, say more about that, or type more, type more about that. As you guys are thinking about that, let me just say this. I think it becomes important then to think about how leadership functions in systems in order to go through that. So that gets us to where we're talking about with regard to holistic leadership. That holistic leadership is a way of recognizing the imaginative world that we're called to step into with leadership and the different kinds of intelligences that we need um, to to uh, to engage in that way. So I'm going to go ahead and forward the slide. From my art background, um, there is a sculptor, an American sculptor named Klaus Oldenburg. Let me just go one past him. He does these larger than life things. This is at the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City. They have these giant shuttlecocks on the lawn, and the joke is that the museum is the net, and there's some on the other side. Oldenburg has this thing when we talk about holistic, about trying to balance things that are going on. He says what matters is the internal poetry and consistency of the work, but it is also necessary that each work involve an outside reference, typical and universal. And the adjustment of all the requirements on an unconscious level is what takes time on an unconscious level necessarily. Now, that is a very dense quotation, and I probably read it 6 or 7 times before I even began to get at what he's saying. But here's my interpretation of what Oldenburg is saying. He's saying when I do a piece of art, there has to be something internal that's going on there that makes sense to itself. It's happening inside me. I get this vision. But then if it doesn't also connect to an outside reference that other people connect to, then it will not communicate. And the adjustment of the internal reality that's going on in here and the external reality to what it's bearing witness to takes time and often happens at an unconscious level, which again goes back to this holistic idea that when we talk about leadership, oftentimes what leaders are doing is they're perceiving internally something that's going on inside them as they lead. And oftentimes they're doing that in advance of the people that they're leading. I don't know if you have all ever experienced that. It's part of what having a vision is, that you begin to have an internal poetry and a consistency of something that you see as a vision inside, but people don't necessarily have that with you as you begin to go. And so you have to bring people along into this story, and the adjustment of that, both inside you and with your congregation, takes time to see develop. I'm going to skip past this. And so here's where I want to begin to talk, because I think as a leader, if we're going to be effective at leading holistically and responding to the opportunity to engage imaginatively in our context, we need to recognize the multifaceted way that as leaders, we're being called to engage. So I'm going to start out with this frame. And the first is knowing what we know. And again, I'm going to give a brief overview of all of this and then go back and talk in depth about more of each. But what do we know? What do we see going on around us? What are our perceptions about what's happening in the environment? How do we engage the text? How do we engage with people? This is a critical mode of engagement, how we transfer information, how we see reality. The next is our being, our presence. Who are we? What is our way of engaging with people? Third, what are we doing? What are the things we do together? What are our practices? And then the fourth frame is relating. What is the posture that we have as we engage with people in the leadership style that we have. Those four things are a holistic way of thinking about what we're doing when we lead. Just want to make sure. And is everybody able to hear me okay? Is that going okay? Josephine, I'm just noting what you have said there. I know I move around a little bit when I talk, and so if I'm going out of the range of the microphone, I just want to stay closer. Okay, good. Okay, so knowing, being, doing, relating. Now, I don't know about how it works for you all in terms of how you were trained, but the majority of my seminary training and most of what I see in terms of resources for leadership in ministry is in that bottom left quadrant and in the top right quadrant. What we know and what we do. But it's even a little bit more, is perverse the right word than that? Or maybe a little bit more pragmatic than that, because I think what we're often doing in the way that we currently do ministry is not knowing. We have a world that's consumed with data on one hand, and then instead of doing, it's consumed with techniques. And I think one of the real challenges of ministry right now is that it's disintegrated. That we are always engaging in knowing, being, doing, and relating ways, but oftentimes we are doing the being and the relating quadrants unconsciously. And we're focused primarily on knowing the right information and trying to address the challenges of our environment as leaders with more information or with techniques, becoming experts at running programs, doing models, these kinds of things. And so I think for leadership to be holistic and to engage in creativity and to be imaginative in terms of being able to go into new places, all four of these things at any given point need to be activated. And I don't mean just going on subconsciously, because they are, but I mean we need to be aware of our perceptions, our story about what's happening in front of us. We need to be aware of our presence, what we bring to an environment relationally. We need to think about how we're embodying those things in practices and whether the things that we're doing make sense given where we are. We think about how we're relating with each other. So we can talk more about those, and I have a little poll to do at the end related to those things, but I want to skip and I want to talk about each one of these four quadrants in turn. And so when I talk first about knowing, I want to talk about a framework for how we think about where we are in terms of our ministry context. I want to say that there are three overlapping spheres that we need to perceive, that we need to be aware of. The first is our context. Where are we? What is the community that we're a part of? How is meaning made in this community? What are the traditions? What are the stories? What are the metaphors that people use to describe what their life is like? This is such a critical aspect of ministry because of the incarnation. Obviously, that's true. But I think so often when we inherit traditions, oftentimes we inherit traditions that were birthed in a context that is different than the one we're in. And then when we begin to talk about changing those things, we ignite anxiety emotionally and relationally at changing them because we're trying to bring our communities into the context that we now find ourselves because there's a disconnect there. So the first sphere that we've got to be aware of is context. Where are we? How do we make meaning? What are the stories of this place? So that's how we start. The second is theology. Where, who is God? What is the gospel? How do we communicate good news in this context? The reason I start with context is that theology is always contextualized. We don't have an acontextual framework from which to engage our theology. So where we are and how we use language and how we employ different metaphors and stories has a huge impact on our theology. And the second kind of frame, then, the second sphere after context is our theological context. the way in which we're describing what it means to be God's people. The third are our systems and structures. These are the ways in which our congregation's life gets embodied out of where we are and what we believe. So we have our location, we have our beliefs, and then those things get embodied in systems and then structures that give shape to our common life. So, does your church have small groups? That's a system and a structure that is speaking to your context and your theology. Do you preach? If so, how long? Some places people preach for 10 minutes, other times people preach for 25 minutes, some people preach for 45 minutes. Do you have a board of elders? Why or why not? How is money handled? Where I think dynamic engagement happens is in this center place here, where it just lit up green. It's when we are deeply connected to and understand the context of the world that we're living in the place that we're being called to, the neighborhood and the people. When we've wrestled with our theology in a way that is articulatable in our context, and yet also is honoring the scriptures and what the story of God's up to. And then our systems and structures, the way that we're inviting people into that life, give shape to our context and our theology. This place right here is dynamic engagement. When we are in that moment, it is really significant. This is the kingdom coming. Now, here's what I found, and I don't know if you guys have found this, but in the work I've done both here in my own context, the work I've done consulting with church leaders, the work I did in New Zealand in denominations and in theological colleges, was that oftentimes a church or a denomination is willing to engage one, maybe two of these spheres, but rarely all three. So you might have a context where people are completely culturally relevant and they're willing to change their systems and structures at a drop of a hat. But man, do not mess with their theology. You know what I mean? There's other places where they're willing to go pretty far with their theology, engaging it, asking questions. They're willing at a certain point to adjust their systems and structures, but they are so culturally out of touch that it doesn't matter how much they're willing to do their theology and engage their systems and structures, because they're so far removed from the environment that they're called to serve that there's no connecting point there. The third, and this is often the case with more traditional denominations, is that they're willing to engage the context, they're willing to engage the theology, but man, do not touch the systems and structures. Do not mess with our worship liturgy. Do not mess with our budgeting processes. Do not mess with our leadership structure. And the reason why that one can become so testy is because that's often where the power lives in an organization. And so I want to pause for a second and call your attention to a poll that's over on the right-hand side. And it's asking a couple questions. Of the three spheres of engagement, which does your particular congregation need to address the most? And then immediately following that is similar. Of the three spheres of engagement, which does your particular denomination need to address the most? Yeah. So that can be really challenging at times to know how to do that. But it is really critical that if we're going to be creatively engaging with the context of the world that we're a part of, the way in which we're discerning what the needs are, the way we're discerning how God might be speaking into a particular place means that we've got to be engaged in that place. And that can be tremendously challenging. So anyway, so when I talk back, if you think now back a slide, um, into the four modes of engagement. When I talk about knowing, this is a little bit of what I'm trying to get at. What are our perceptions? What do we need to know about our context? Not what's the right data, but what do we need to know about our context in order to engage it? What do we need to know about our theology so that we can articulate it, be faithful to it, and have it respond in a way that honors and engages creatively and imaginatively our context? And then what do we need to know about our systems and structures and how they're organized and whether or not they're responding to our context and our theology, or whether, and this is the death knell for leadership, we're just going through the motions. And so that's the first thing I want to talk about as it relates to the four modes of engagement, the knowing quadrant. Next, I want to talk about being, which is a different way of engaging. Edwin Friedman, in that book, A Failure of Nerve, says what counts is a leader's presence and being, not technique and know how. I don't know if you all have had experiences of that or not, but I know for me in my context, when I left Jacob's Well, I had been the founding senior pastor and the dominant leader in the community as the founding pastor for a long time. And then I left, and for 2 years, the congregation didn't have a senior pastor or a consistent communicator. And so there was quite a bit of anxiety in that transition process. When I came back and reassumed that role 2 years later, there had been a lot of anxiety, a lot of challenges, a lot of reaction in the congregation. The congregation was tremendously charged with fear, anxiety, frustration, resentment, all these things. And there were things that needed to happen that I could look at it and see this needs to happen. And until these things happen, we will not experience the kind of life that we need to experience together here. But I could not come in the role that I was in and take charge. I could not come in and be the answer guy, if that makes sense. What I needed to do was come in and be present, to not have all the answers, but to be relationally connected to my community. In a sense, I needed to be willing to help drain the anxiety from the congregation, not by introducing more of it myself, by forcing more change, but by allowing myself to take on the anxiety of the community and let me be upset, let me struggle, and let them have a time of healing. It really matters who we are and the way we bring ourselves to our context, especially when we want to introduce change. Emotional system theory says that every system, a family system, a marriage, a neighborhood, a congregation, is an emotional system. And every emotional system has to deal with anxiety. Now, when we talk about transforming systems, you can exchange the word anxiety for change. They equal the same thing. Change in an emotional system, change in an emotional system equals anxiety. Let me look here. You speak of not being the answer, but how can you take on the emotional tone and lead them out of it without being the answer guy? Yeah, you know what? That's a great, gosh, Cheryl, what a great question. Um, One thing is, I think there's a shift in tone that happens when you see yourself not as the answer person, but as a person who has the ability to tell a story about where we are. Does that make sense? I think sometimes what we do, especially if we think in terms of that quadrant again, go back to that quadrant, and the first quadrant is knowing. If our orientation is data, then we become the answer person. Here's this problem. And rather than seeing the problem as an emotional, relational reality, I see it as a cognitive problem to be solved. It's not that there aren't cognitive aspects of it that need to be addressed, but oftentimes that's not what needs to happen first. And this is where presence and being comes in, and is so important. Um, I find in my own life, I look at it in the scriptures, Jesus so often responds to crisis with a story. It's a perception. And when you give an answer, people either have to agree with you or disagree with you. It creates that false dichotomy. So maybe circling back around to the question that Goss asked earlier, can I give an example of this? Not specifically, but I can give a context where we do this. We give an answer, and people are either forced to say this or that, yes or no. Um, and oftentimes we make things more important than they really are, and we expend leadership capital that doesn't need to be expended because we framed it as a yes or no question. And I think what we can often do instead is invite people to say, hey, let me tell you in this knowledge quadrant, mediated by my presence, what I'm perceiving. What do you perceive? Are we in the same universe? Are we in the same context? So that might be a way that I would at least initially think about doing that. I'm going to keep going. I got another quote from you. This is from Otto Scharmer. He says that successful leadership depends on the quality of attention and intention that a leader brings to any situation. I think that's so important. Note that not just the amount, but the quality of attention and intention. So, two leaders in the same circumstances doing the same thing can bring about completely different outcomes depending on the inner place from which each operates. Have you all seen that in your own experience? Yes, yeah, yeah. So two people doing the exact same thing get very different outcomes, and that's because the hidden aspect of leadership is this inner sphere of presence and being. We bring to any set of problems or opportunities, and that's a very different distinction. Some person coming to the same set of circumstances might see it as an opportunity, others as a problem. But we bring to that an internal way of attending to it and intending towards it that has a huge outcome impact on the outcome. Um, I don't generally like to do all these quotes, but let me just do one more. This from Peter Senge. He says, we have come to believe that the core capacity needed to access the field of the future is presence. There's a future that wants to come into the presence. That's what Jesus is talking about when the kingdom of God is at hand. God's future is arriving in the presence through his ministry, through his life. And the church is called to be, according to N.T. Wright, a colony of the future in the present. So this is a secular business guru writing about leadership and talking about the future that wants to come into the present. I love this. And the way that we access the future is by being present, not by having all the answers, but by being here now, being at the nexus of context, theology, and our systems and structures. We first thought of presence as being fully conscious and aware in the present moment. Then we began to appreciate present as deep listening, of being open beyond one's preconceptions and historical ways of making sense. We've come to see the importance of letting go of old identities and the need to control. Ultimately, we came to see all of these aspects of presence as leading to a state of letting come, of consciously participating in a larger field for change. When this happens, the field shifts, and the forces shaping the situation can move from recreating the past to manifesting or realizing an emerging future. I just think that's tremendously hopeful and in some ways describes what it means for the kingdom to come, that rather than going through the motions, rather than kind of mindlessly or slavishly attending to what's gone on, we perceive our context, our theology, our systems and structures, and then we engage that reality, that perception with a presence that's non-anxious and open in order to allow something new to come in the midst of that. So that's presence. I'm sure you all have seen this illustration before. This is an iceberg, obviously, and the genius of the image is that what we see seems immense, but what we don't see is the reality of this thing. So 80% of the iceberg is beneath the surface, and I think that when we are leading, this is the reality. The top little part there above the surface of the water, 10 to 20%, is what we think is what people are engaging with. But we are bringing all that's beneath the surface and well. And so that's why being is so significant. Our presence is so significant in terms of how we lead. So knowing, first quadrant, being, second quadrant, that then leads to the third quadrant, which is our practices, or what we're going to do, how we're going to structure our life together. And I think practices is a really important thing that is in terms of thinking what it means to lead in a creative way. What are the habits of life that you as a leader are cultivating? What are the habits of life that you're cultivating with your staff or your leadership team or your elders or your governing body? What are the ways that you're inviting people to step into this alternate reality? I think that oftentimes the standard is, well, we have church on Sunday, we might have a midweek thing, and we do all those things. But when we think about practices, we're trying to say, what is the way of life that we're inviting people to live? And so maybe a helpful way to think about this in terms of this third quadrant of engagement of doing is that we have practices that we take on. So if you look across your congregation and you had to analyze your congregation, what are the practices that you do that animate or give shape to your life together? A couple more words are helpful in thinking about that. What are the spaces that they happen in? And what's the rhythm or the consistency that those things are happening? If you look at your congregation, if you look at your leadership rhythm, we all have practices, spaces, and rhythms with which we do them. Most of these things we do unconsciously. Most of these things we inherit. We do this in our own life as well. We have a practice of watching TV. We have 3 bedrooms or 3 rooms in the house that have TVs, and we watch it an hour a day to 2 hours a day and maybe 4 hours on the weekends. So that's our practice. Those are the spaces. That's the rhythm. Our congregations are made up of practices that are then done in spaces with a certain kind of rhythm to them. And so when we think about perceiving where we are, our context, our theology, and our systems and structures, this is often the systems and structure stuff, what we do. And oftentimes, if we want to lead transformational change, we have to keep doing some of the things that have been done in the past. Because when we blow those things up too prematurely, that introduces enormous anxiety in the emotional system. But we can also pilot simultaneously new things, new practices. We're inviting new people or old people or regular people into new spaces and a new rhythm that in some way seek to embody the theology and the context of what we're talking about. So that's a really important aspect to what's going on here. And then finally, I want to turn the corner because we're beginning to get low on time, and that is the relating framework. And hopefully we'll have enough time if anybody wants to ask me questions, particularly about this, when we can do that. In the relating quadrant, This becomes really important because I would imagine some of you in some ways are interested in this idea of holistic leadership and of how that affects change because of the context of your ministry. And so I want to talk about change dynamics and what it looks like in terms of introducing change into an environment, because leaders were often very naive about how this happens and the amount of time it takes, which is why we then introduce anxiety in the congregation that has to be dispelled. And so there are kind of two axes on which we need to think about change. On the vertical axes, we're talking about the level of difficulty. So from the bottom, it's not very difficult. The top, it's tremendously difficult. On the horizontal axis, we're now talking about time. So the amount of time at the beginning, not very much time. Over time, we're talking as it moves to the right there, a lot of time. So when we think about change, what we often do is we think in terms of changing people's knowledge. And we normally do that. Think back now to the four kind of quadrants of engagement. We think in terms of changing people's data. But look at this. It's not very hard to change what people know, and it doesn't take very long. You come to a 1 hour webinar with Tim Keel on a Thursday afternoon, and you get some new information, right? You start to think a little bit differently because of the learning that I've done that I'm now conveying to you guys. But there's not very much time invested, and you've had to sit at a computer for an hour and kind of mess with the technology. The difficulty hasn't been very hard. To get to the next level of change, though, requires, as you might guess, more time, more difficulty. And so the next level of change is in attitudes. Okay, so first starts here, second is with your heart. To change people's attitudes is a lot hard. To give them new information, to take what you've heard me say here and go tell it to your congregation in a sermon, to distill it, doesn't take very much. But though people might be nodding with you, in here they might be going, oh no, you don't. That's not going to happen. Because attitudes are hidden and they go on in the heart. And then we get to the third aspect of introducing change into an environment. And now we're talking about individual behavior. So first thing you do is you change what they know, or you try to change what people know. You give them more information. The second thing you need to do is over time, people's attitudes change. Then their behavior changes. Finally, group behavior. It's one thing to change what one person does, but to change the behavior of a congregation, for example, it's incredibly difficult and it takes an enormous amount of time. And my experience is that as leaders, we are profoundly naive about what it takes to introduce change. I remember I was at one point when I was in my late 20s being mentored by a pastor in his mid 60s. And he said to me, Tim, most pastors think the amount of time between the conception of an idea to when it becomes fruitful or to its fruition is 3 months. He said it's never less than 3 years. Never less than 3 years. And as a guy that had only been in ministry a little while, I just could not conceptualize that. Now I'm in my mid 40s, right? And I'm going, oh yeah, this is the long game. The long arc of this thing is really significant. It is like turning the Queen Mary, Catherine. That's a great analogy. And so what we can see happening here is this kind of arc over time. And you can see why presence and practices become so important. You perceive where you are and what you need to do based on your context, your theology, the systems and structures that you've already got in place. You begin to think about your own presence in the midst of that. And as you do that, trying to be non-anxious yourself and drain anxiety from the congregation by being in touch with people and in conversations and telling stories, you begin to introduce new practices and new spaces and new rhythms. And it just takes time. And that's where the relating piece comes in. So much good change does not happen because people think in terms of data and technique, not perception and practices. And they completely ignore the being or the presence and the knowing, which is our postures, sides of the leadership quadrants for engagement. And this is so critical. So, what oftentimes leaders also do is they go hear a talk about holistic leadership, and they've spent very little time and have very little difficulty in buying into the concepts. But then what they want to do is they want to go back and preach one sermon and expect group behavior to change. I've done it myself. And can you begin to see why that is just doomed to failure? Why we've got to think more holistically about what's going on here? It's really a significant emotional, relational process. So let me skip here. And so I want to talk about the mode of leadership presence required based on the context of the system. When you have a new church work, a church plant, or when you have an immature system, or your system is unhealthy, or it's damaged in some way, the congregational context in which you're leading, then there is a really strong need for a strong eye, a strong leader who's directing and being very directive in terms of what they're doing there. When the system is more developed, more mature, healthy, and thriving, then that creates a context where there's a greater degree of the ability to be more collaborative. When a system's in crisis, it needs strong leadership. It needs a differentiated leader who has a strong sense of I and can perceive what needs to happen and lead it in a way that's significant. When the system is really healthy, then the leader can let go a lot of some of those things and invite more people in to do this. Let me get to your question in just a second because I want to talk about the fact that then between these developed and developing, mature, immature, healthy, unhealthy, thriving, damaged systems, there's a transitional space or a liminal space that's there, and that oftentimes our congregations are moving through these places. And so as a leader, part of being holistic is recognizing the need at times to have to be strong and also interdependent with people in that regard. So a charge that a minister never really has a chance to be ready for change. Never really has a chance to change. Yeah, I mean, I think, for example, let me just give you an example of where I think where this dynamic is really hard. I don't know how you guys your polity works, but in Methodist churches, they have itinerancy where pastors change every couple of years at the discretion of the bishop. So if it takes 3 years, yeah. So when that happens, that leader is just beginning to get in place and develop the credibility incarnationally to lead the kind of change that needs to happen. And so you're basically creating an emotional system of crisis that will never stop revolving. Here's what I know, that when you move into a new ministry context for the first 2 to 2.5 years, you are inheriting the problems and the benefits of the previous leader. For the first couple of years of your leadership, you are responding to not your own leadership, but to the psychic and spiritual resonances of the one that has come before you. And so in that sense, it can be really challenging. And a lot of, like, for example, now going to the Methodists in this example, you think about their context and their theology and their systems and structures. When they came up with the itinerancy model, it was a very different context of expansion America and a shortage of pastors and a different theology. And so the idea of a systems and structure where you had pastors moving on all the time made total sense. In a profoundly mobile culture where nothing is stable, the idea that a church would also not have stability in leadership, I think is devastating. I think it's devastating and makes the incarnation really hard. It never allows the anxiety to drain out of the system. So anyway, yeah, so let me just see what I have left. Let me just say this, one more illustration. This is from a book called, let me pull it up here, Organizational Life Cycles. by Lawrence Miller, and he talks about how every system or structure or congregation or business or school has two focal points. To the left, uh, a system is focused on the environment. New churches, they're engaged in mission, they're responding to something um, to go on to. Um, but as the organization ages, in the early stages of its life, it's led by a visionary. Visionary is often great at seeing and communicating a call to mission, but detail and implementation and organizational ability are not usually the visionary's strong suits. And so, as the organization ages, it becomes led by what they call a barbarian. And a barbarian is a hard-headed leader that's willing to implement change no matter what the price. They take the visionary's ideas and they rest it into a kind of shape. They organize and will do whatever it takes to take the dream into reality. But barbarians, they have their cost, so they have a shelf life. And then you move into what's called a builder, according to Miller. He says they have the specialized skills to help an organization to grow and develop. But what you can see happening now is that as the leadership community changes, the different leadership typologies change, the focus is moving away from the environment and turning more into the organization itself. So whereas initially an organization, a church, a denomination is focused on engaging the environment, the context, you know how you all, when I did the original poll, where does your congregation, where does your denomination need to focus? A lot of you said context. That's because in its early days it was focused on the environment, but as the organization has grown, it becomes more focused on itself. When it goes over the hump, which is where we're about to go, it becomes focused on itself. Yes, this absolutely applies to the denomination, to the judicatory. And so when it goes over the hump, then the organization starts to be led by administrators. And initially, administrators serve the mission of the organization, but gradually there's a reversal. The organization begins to be shaped by the rules and the regulations and the traditions that emerge from administrative leadership. So this right here is the systems and structures that will not change, even though the context and the theology may have gone through a shift. Okay, then from the administrator, you move to an organization led by bureaucrats, and bureaucrats impose a tight grip of control over the entire organization. And at this point in an organization's life, anybody that's a visionary or a barbarian, they've left the organization. There's no room for them anymore. Finally, the last stage in the death knell of an organization in its life cycle is the aristocrat, and the aristocrat lives off the system. The system now lives to support the leadership that is at the top of it. It exists to maintain the current function and live off the remaining resources of the system. So now let's think about going back to where I started and talk about a crisis of imagination. We're disconnected from the environment. We're disconnected from people who engage the environment and are willing to see things differently. And this is why we have a crisis of imagination and why there's a need for people to be willing to differentiate themselves from the system in order to bring the kind of leadership that is required, which is holistic leadership. So, this is really challenging stuff. This is emotional stuff. This is relational stuff, and this is where having data is important, but where emotional presence, being, relating, and practices begin to be so integral to the work of leadership. So at this point, I'm going to pause and I'm going to see if anybody has any specific questions that I can answer. We're right at about an hour, but if anybody has any specific things that I can either give a little bit more context or content to, or if there's anything that you're wanting to kind of put out there. Josephine, I don't know if we have any time or if we just need to cut it off, but I'm happy to do whatever. Yeah, I mean, I'm good at this point. I do have a couple
I
more
think
polls that we might take an
folks are probably
opportunity
really engaged with what
to
you're
look
saying,
at.
but we did promise an hour webinar, so
One
I just
is
want to do
which
a
mode
quick
of
check-in.
leadership presence does
Um,
your current
Tim, how
ministry
much
context
time
require?
do you
And I
feel you
showed
need
that
to
I
wrap
or
up
we
and to kind of take
continuum, whether
questions?
or not that is. And the other of the four quadrants that I discussed, which are you interested in learning more about? The knowing, the being, the doing, and the relating. I see that Catherine's typed of questions. Would clergy groups help seeking wisdom from peers? Yeah. Anyway.
Well, I'll just suggest then maybe we take another 10 minutes and hopefully that'll give us enough time. If folks are okay with that, if you could indicate by putting a check mark beside your name. I think most of you have figured out how to do that, but at the top of your screen there's a little figure with the raised hand. Click the little arrow to the right of the figure and a drop down menu appears. So we've got three green checks.
Yeah. I think clergy groups could be immensely
And
helpful,
maybe Audrey will
as
respond
long
in a
as
minute.
they're clergy
I
groups
know
that
that
are
Audrey was having
aware of the
some
dynamics of
connection
what's going on in
problems,
this
so
organizational
I'll
life
take that
cycle.
as a go
If it's
ahead,
a
Tim, and if
clergy group that's
Audrey
filled
or
with
anyone else
five
needs
or
to
six
sign off at any
bureaucrats
time,
or
you're perfectly
administrators,
free to do that. So
that's
thanks.
going to be that there's not going to be the kind of outside pulse of energy. Um, so yeah, I think that can be challenging, and I think people that are longer term in place can also be helpful. They can also be more mired in. I think that requires great discernment. Yeah, yeah, absolutely not just being grumpy and complaining, because I think when change happens, it is flummoxing. And one of the let me throw this out here. Some of you might remember the story in First Samuel where Hannah goes to the temple praying for a child. Eli, we're told, is completely out of touch with the spiritual life of Israel. His sons are scoundrels abusing the power, and Hannah prays for a son, is given a son, and um, and Hannah, in her joy, dedicates Samuel to the priesthood and to the temple. And when he's weaned, she takes him and presents him to Eli. And then there's this extraordinary exchange that happens. Do you remember it? The voice of the word of the Lord that has been silent for generations, God's now speaking again. And Samuel's name, Shema El, means God hears. So God's now interacting with Israel because there's now someone that can respond. So Samuel wakes up, hears God's voice, doesn't know what he's hearing. So he wakes up Eli thinking that Eli is calling to him. Eli, in the exchange, is not hearing it. A couple of those things happen, and then finally Eli goes, "Oh, God is talking." I think that's a tremendously suggestive for us. That I think that there are often young leaders who hear God's voice but don't know what they're hearing. There are older leaders or traditional contexts that no longer hear God's voice, but they know what it sounds like and they know how to help shape those leaders. And my experience has been that there needs to be a community between young leaders who are engaged in context, but yet who lack the wisdom and the experience to know how to frame it. And then we've got older leaders that are no longer knowing how to respond to what's going on, um, but yet have the ability, the wisdom, the resources to leverage. And the tragedy is those two groups often do this against each other. And the question becomes, can denominations create a relational framework where power is not held in one or the other, but it's a real communitas of equality and engagement and respect in order to discern what God is up to. And I think that's in some ways where traditional denominations have some resources, but the emotional processes often put young leaders against old leaders and old leaders against young leaders in a way that's not fruitful. Yeah, an Eli event. That's a great name. I like that. Boy, that's the truth. The pitting happens in very concrete aspects like many times. Yeah, and I think isn't that the challenge of the gospel? Because I mean, it becomes about power and privilege and who gets to determine versus servanthood, and I think that gets back to the theology when we're in those three spheres of context and theology and systems and structures. The systems and structures can drive the theology versus letting the theology drive the systems and structures and seeing ourselves as vying for power and authority. Again, you can see again why the change over time is so significant, why practices matter, and why presence is so significant. I know that in the context of where I came in New Zealand, you have a number of traditional denominations that are very much on the administrative, bureaucratic, aristocratic sign of the continuum and are struggling to remain relevant in the context of that world. And yet there are a bunch of young leaders who are visionaries and barbarians wanting to engage, and the dynamic there is so um, challenging to know how to mediate that space. And oftentimes leaders end up leaving because they want to do something creative, and yet the environment won't allow them to do so. Yeah. Yeah, in terms of speaking more about relating, helping the congregation to see their light of God in their midst. Yeah, I think relating in some ways connects pretty deeply to what I was talking about in presence. Um, I think I think certainly that's the case. How do you, Cheryl? I want to make sure I understand what you're asking me. Helping the congregation see their light of God, and yeah, yeah, helping people to interpret the activity of God in their lives and know how to participate in it. Yeah, that's a really important thing, and I think that's also part of what it gets back to with regard to practices. In other words, if people are only coming on Sunday, listening to you talk about it, and then left to themselves the rest of the week to try and figure out and interpret where God is at work in their lives, and they only get the 20-minute thing on Sunday, then that becomes a really important 20 minutes. And often we load it with more than it can reasonably be expected to deliver. And so, what are the like? So, for example, it's Lent, and it's Thursday here, and on we really take on some practices during the season of Lent to embody the invitation. We have a sermon series that is going to go on through Lent about Lenten things. We're using different pericopes from the gospel where Jesus is moving to the cross. On Thursday mornings, we open our chapel at 6:30 in the morning for Lectio and invite our congregation to come. We also resource small group leaders to use the same information. At noon, we open up the building and we do 20 minutes of centering prayer. We also invite people to fast on Thursday and then to come and share a meal and break fast together on Thursday night. And then we talk about our experiences of both what we're learning in the congregational space, what we're experiencing during the day, what the experience of fasting is like as we sit down and break bread together. That's a practice. Those are practices in spaces and rhythms. We don't do those all the time, but during the Lenten season. So we look at our year, we look at our liturgical rhythms, and we say, how can we create spaces that allow people to experience God, experience each other, um, and then not just that, but then interpret that together, and talk about it in ways that are significant. And so, yeah, so all that is a framework of relating. Josephine, I don't know if it might be helpful to show that couple-minute video. We have a really, we do a lot of creative stuff with worship, and we write most of our own music, and we've got a huge number of young musicians in a recording studio. And This is about a 3-minute video that shows our worship team and our worship pastor and can give people just a look, not in terms of always perfectly illustrating what we're talking about, but into the culture of creativity that exists at our church and how that plays out. Yeah, that's a great idea. So it might be helpful to watch that. It might not, and we could also just wrap up. All right. Do I hit play?
I didn't want to call our first record the Mike Crawford Band or the Mike Crawford Project. I knew my name had to be associated with it in some regard, but I also wanted it to have a name or a band name, and so I started thinking about that and the fact that we're not really just a single band, but it's more like a collective of about 40 or 50 musicians. I was actually reading a family fun magazine. I've got 3 little kids. There was an article that was entitled Secret Siblings, and it described a process where you have your children give each other gifts in secret. And it just felt like a good fit because we as a community of musicians were making these gifts sort of down in the basement, sort of in a secret way, for our other brothers and sisters, both in our own church, and I felt like possibly a gift for the church at large. I guess my job is sort of like a conductor or a director. That's sort of how I look at the production process. I know the strengths and limitations of most of the players. They've been playing here for a long time, and so I know where to push them and where to guide them. These are just folks who are part of our community, who work day jobs, all of them. The limitations of most of the players, they've been playing here for a long time, and so I know where to push them and where to guide them. These are just folks who are part of them, and all of them. They love to play music, and I love to help them put that together. Lyrical content on the lyrical content on the records and the songs that we write. Most of it is driven by scripture. Most of it is deeply thought out. It's thinking at it for what maybe Jesus is really saying. This band is scripture through a modern or postmodern lens and trying to look at it for what maybe Jesus is really saying. This band is more than just a typical church worship team. It's not just 7 or 8 people on stage every week. This is a community of people creating beautiful and strange, I would say, works of art. You know, we strive for beauty and creativity in what we do, and that's what's so exciting about, I think, what we do. And I think community does that. It's
Yeah, I think it's a brilliant metaphor for what I think good leadership does. I mean, Mike is clearly leading there, but he's working between the I we thing that I showed up there, and that might be a good point to put the poll up there about which mode of leadership your current ministry context requires, because it's an art. It's not a science. It's an art. Um, and so, yeah, I think jazz is a good metaphor. And I wonder, Josephine, maybe if we also put up the final poll about the four quadrants, because we've talked about knowing and the perceptions that we need to have, and we've talked about being our presence and doing the practices and relating our postures as we engage people. So, which feel most important to you in your context of ministry? Um, yeah. Let me well, I was looking for that Gilbert, the not Gilbert, the Friedman book. At the end of the PowerPoint presentation, I've given a very short bibliography that you might find really helpful. But the book, A Failure of Nerve: Leadership in the Age of the Quick Fix by Edwin Friedman, is a great title, especially when you talk about this relating side. The other is a book, I think's on there, but just in the event that it's not, I'll type it in the dialogue line. It's called Extraordinary Leadership: Thinking Systems Making a Difference. The woman is Roberta Gilbert, and it's again systems theory on emotional systems. And she did all her doctoral research in congregations. So this isn't necessarily written from a Christian perspective, but the context she uses is congregational situations. So Extraordinary Leadership, Roberta Gilbert. This is a fantastic resource. Um, I think she's either at Georgetown or University of Virginia, but she is a great asset in terms of what she's saying. Um, so anyway, I think that's about all I got. If anybody else has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. But it's been great interacting with you all.
Well, thanks so much, Tim. You've given us lots to think about, and I certainly appreciate your paradigms and ways of thinking about knowing, being, doing, and relating in our ministry contexts. So I know people are just typing in their final comments. Just a few reminders. We did record this webinar, so I know that Audrey had a few technical issues, and so Audrey, you'll be able to see this again next week sometime when it's available. Once it's available, you will receive an email to let you know, and so you can forward this on to others you think might be interested. This was a paid webinar, so there will be a fee for the recording as well. Next week, I'd just like to draw your attention to the webinar on Wednesday at 2 o'clock Eastern Time on the book Grace in the Trinity, that is co-authored by United Church leaders Ross Lockhart and Rob Fennell, who's a professor at the Atlantic School of Theology. Finally, the PowerPoint presentation that you saw today is available for downloading and for if you want to